This is the wrap-up by Progress Canada. Today we're joined by pollster Kyla Ronellenfitsch. Kyla has over a decade of experience conducting research in Canada and the United States. She founded her own research firm, Realize Strategies, in 2021. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here. I'm excited.
All right. So I think a lot of other people are excited about this conversation too. So before we really get into the data, which we know everyone's here is going to be here for, we're going to make them wait a little longer and talk a little bit about your company, about the kind of work you do. But I think a lot of people have a vague idea of what a pollster does, but I think you have a really specific methodology that you use, and people's high level understanding of it may not be accurate. So can you talk a little bit about what you do? Focusing in a bit on qualitative polling, because I think people are less familiar with that.
Yeah, I actually started, so my company, Relay Strategies, I started in 2021, and it started as a qualitative research company. It's sort of, the story, I guess, is like a little, ironic, I guess, which is I had gone back to school to do a master's in data science. And by the time I finished the degree, I really missed talking to people and having qualitative conversations. So often people, when they think of qualitative research, they think of a focus group, which is, they're great. I still do focus groups, but they're, very expensive and they have a long kind of startup time. So I developed a new methodology to do them a little bit more nimbly, and that's, I call it my tech snapshot. So I conduct qualitative research through text message, and that's also a methodology that I used to work for a Democratic polling firm in the US called Change Research, and they had also adopted my qualitative method. So both the texting and also I have a different approach to doing in-depth interviews. So once they had adopted that, we had submitted for a Reed Award. It's a couple of years ago now, which is kind of like, I don't know, the Oscars of nerd politics things. And so we had won a big award on best new methodology. So unfortunately we submitted under Change's name. So I don't have the plaque in my background, but still very, very exciting.
I want to talk about, so you talked about text-based, which I think is really, really important. And the way I sort of think of qualitative polling is it's the polling version of deep canvassing in my mind, where instead of just doing head counts, you're actually trying to figure out what is really driving people's opinions to better understand it. Because I think one of the things with polling is you can have this data come out, but it may not necessarily mean what you think it does. And this is why I think we sometimes get gaps between, the polling industry is actually pretty accurate lately, despite claims otherwise. But I think sometimes there's a bit of a gap because people say one thing, but they actually have a different feeling behind it. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. And also, just to be clear, for the data that we're going to talk about today, it is quantitative polling data. So it's from an online survey. It is, statistically sound and rigorous. We look at qualitative research more for getting a deeper understanding. Like if someone says, I somewhat agree to something, well, what does that mean? Are they pushing back on something? Do they actually not understand the words in the statement? There could be a million reasons why someone would register the opinion that they have, let's say in a survey, or if they say they have a somewhat favorable impression of a politician. Again, that could be I actually don't really know. Or so when you are doing qualitative research, it allows you to actually understand more of what is triggering an opinion and go a little deeper. And sometimes you're completely off base. You might not even be asking the correct questions in the first place. I think of how long housing was kind of off of, let's say, the national agenda. But I'm sure if you were talking to voters, they were housing is crazy expensive, and it probably just is a bit of a lag because we didn't necessarily think of that as a primary federal responsibility. And so there's the qualitative kind of helps you understand things that are top of mind that you might not necessarily be thinking of.
I think that's really interesting because I don't know if you're a movie watcher. I'm a huge movie watcher and I have a letterbox of Canada, of course. And I rate like most things that I'm like, whatever. I don't mind that I watched that, wouldn't watch it again. I rate it as like 3 out of 5 stars.
Yeah.
Some people are more judgmental and rate things lower, but that's sort of my standard thing. And I think it's what you were just talking about, where it's like, I could go either way. I'm a person. And having that more in-depth feeling about it, I think is probably really helpful for understanding that. You mentioned housing. When I was at the Ministry of Housing provincially, that was back in 2015, 16, something like that, and it was definitely bubbling up as an issue. But again, to your point, you didn't see it on the federal scene for a number of years later when it had really bubbled into a crisis. And I think
Yeah.
a lot of provincial issues are like that. Like they don't really get into the federal consciousness until it's become a really, really big problem that's actually really hard to solve. So I'm really interested in the space. I know a lot of our listeners are really interested into the kind of work that you're doing. But like you said, this is not qualitative necessarily. You do get into some of the feelings people have, but let's get into what you've actually done here. So you already, to give people some context, you already regularly poll about leadership in Canada. You've done deep dives on Poilievre, you've done deep dives on Trudeau. Actually, your deep dive on Trudeau in June 2024 is when I thought, okay, things are over. I live in St. Paul's. The by-election was happening. I was like, we are not going to win this. People on the ground were telling me, what are you talking about? Like, we are not going to win this. And it was largely based on your data because a lot of what you had shown about Justin Trudeau at the time reminded me about what people felt about Kathleen Wynne in 2017, 18. And I knew we weren't coming back from that. And some of the exact wording was the same of like the feelings people had about that leadership in particular. So you are not, foreign to this type of deep dive into leadership. This is something you do regularly. And so this summer, you've embarked on a bit of a deep dive onto Bonnie Crombie's leadership in the Ontario Liberal Party and just the Ontario political scene in general. So what were the big takeaways in your research into Bonnie Crombie about how they feel about her leadership, post-provincial election?
Yeah. I could also, take a bit of a step back and give, I guess, a little bit more context. I assume a lot of people that listen to your podcast are like, are partisan liberals, or are like the ultimate of political junkies. And so at some points I might refer to we, which is, I mean, liberals. Like I am a partisan liberal. I worked on the Carney campaign. I worked on the Wynne campaigns. Like I have, I want liberals to win. So I guess that is to say that when I do this research, it is in part, meant to, I think the sometimes when you talk to staffers or you talk to people that are working in politics, sometimes there's a little bit of a frustration with the membership because they're not really seeing it or they don't understand, but they don't have the information, right? Like we actually don't have a lot of partisan lensed data that is released publicly in Canada. And so I'm trying, to kind of fill that gap a little bit. And so when I conducted this research, I actually, when I conducted the research on Trudeau, I had a pretty good intuition of what some of the data might show. That wasn't really the case for this Crombie leadership data. So I really went into it with I actually don't know either way. And so I sort of split the poll into kind of two parts. So one is understanding impressions of her, like what is the state of the leadership? And then if we were to have a leadership race, what could that look like with kind of a slate of different candidates? So to actually get back to your question about her, what I found, and I'll be writing up the findings, or I'm writing up the findings on my Substack, that the way that I kind of categorized it is voters are sort of responding to her with a collective meh. Like they do not dislike her. Like the percentage of Ontarians with a very unfavorable view of Bonnie Crombie is only 16%. There also aren't that many Bonnie Crombie champions. So only 9% have a very favorable view of her. Most people are in kind of a mushy middle where they maybe have a somewhat favorable, somewhat, or a neutral view. The plurality of voters actually just have a kind of neutral view of her. So she really is, I would describe it as kind of a blank slate. And I also looked at, how big of a factor she was in the most recent election result. So I'd asked PC voters, why did they vote for Doug Ford? And I asked OLP voters, why did they vote for the Liberals? And in both directions, she really wasn't that significant of a factor. So PC voters voted for Ford because they like Ford and they felt like the PCs were missing the moment for the most part, or were meeting the moment for the most part. A dislike of Bonnie Crombie, so like a negative partisanship, or for that matter, a dislike of Marit Stiles, were the two least relevant factors that I tested. So it really wasn't about alternative leadership in the same way that, let's say, the federal result was very much related to people disliking Pierre Poilievre, kind of in both directions. People really liking him, really disliking him.
What I found really interesting about that part of the data is that, you know, I'm online a lot. I see the arguments people are making for against Bonnie Crombie's continued leadership, and you know, I posed them to her as well directly. But one of the big arguments people had was, you know, events just took over and she had no way to break through. No one could have won this campaign. And I think your data shows that a lot of Ford voters basically felt like that party was well established to deal with what was going on with Trump and all that kind of stuff. Then, you know, on the flip side, a lot of those liberal supporters who are maybe against Crombie will also say, well, like, she didn't add anything to it. Anyone could have, you know, performed to that level. And your data also sort of shows that, where it says, you know, like, these people were voting liberal regardless of what was going on. So I do think it's kind of interesting because, like, both the for and against arguments are present there. And I don't know if that means, you know, tie goes to the runner or what, but I think your data does sort of give some credence to both of those positions.
Yeah, I would say overall for the research, like, I think that there's still a lot to interpret personally. Like, I don't think that the data is extremely declarative of of kind of the unknowables. Like, how is an average voter supposed to know if she employed, you know, the right like to kind of respond to a campaign that never was? And that is sort of still a task for the membership, is to figure out, can she adapt? And because really the fundamentals haven't changed. Like, Ford is still the leader, and the issue of the day is still, for the most part, right now, is still Trump and the US dynamic. And that is still, like, as much as it is the main topic of our federal scene, it is kind of still the main topic of our provincial politics. And so whether or not she can, you know, persuade the membership of any change of strategy to break through in this environment, like, I don't know, but that would also be the task of any of these potential alternative candidates. It is, I'm originally from Saskatchewan, so I often think of, like, Ontario as just being really funny, which is Ontarians, in my view, think of themselves as, like, Canadians first. So they're, like, more interested in the provincial scene. I find it, like, really hard for, unless things have, like, really gone off the rails, for people to really focus a whole lot on the provincial scene relative to the federal. This is just me, like, kind of musing. So
that's your Ottawa bias.
It's hard, maybe it's hard for it can be really hard to break through as the official opposition, or as, like, an alternative party leader, which maybe that's always the case, but I think especially in Ontario, like, that's hard. So we're gonna have to try something different than strategy wise than what we've been doing for the past couple of years.
You did do a bit of a comparison, just bringing up that sort of federal provincial element. You did do a bit of a comparison of the Liberal Party of Canada and the Ontario Liberal Party, and then Mark Carney and Bonnie Crombie. What's your sort of takeaway from the data there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the federal brand has rebounded significantly, and it's because of Mark Carney. So both he and the federal Liberal Party are, you know, performing quite well in terms of favorability. I will point out that I often hear commentators talk about Doug Ford being the most popular politician in the country. But if you look at, like, an apples to apples, if you look at Ontario, Mark Carney is more popular than Doug Ford within Ontario. So I just, you know, have to point that out. But he's definitely done a tremendous amount to save, really, the federal Liberal brand. And the provincial brand, I would say, is also a little bit I don't know, it's like a dulled brand. It's not that we're facing the hostility that we were in 2018. Like that negativity has gone down substantially. It's not that bad. And more people have a favorable impression of the provincial party than they do of Bonnie Crombie specifically. So again, going back to that kind of just, the partisan motivation of, or the party loyalty motivation of voters who voted for Liberal or voted Liberal in this past provincial election. But it is kind of also a bit of a blank slate. Like there is a lot of brand rebuilding that needs to be done for the provincial party.
On that note, like just because you look at this stuff, day in, day out, do party leaders tend to poll above their party or behind their party? Like I think the Ontario Liberal Party is an interesting beast in that often we poll better as a party when we don't have a permanent leader, which I don't know what that says about our brand, about our leaders. But I know, there was a time when Doug Ford was polling behind his party. Sometimes he's polling ahead of his party. Like what's sort of the standard you've seen in the work you've done?
Both happens, and it's sort of like Carney polls ahead of the federal Liberal Party. I think Doug Ford polls ahead right now of the PC party. It's not in this article, so it's like a little bit. It's in the crosstabs. It'll actually be out next week. And Polyev polls behind the federal party. So it really kind of depends, and a lot of the time it's just reflective of kind of how polarizing the party leader is, or if they have kind of a, I don't know, I don't want to say fandom, but like a strong support base themselves. If not, then it often is like party brand that kind of takes over.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Crombie's brand specifically, because I think, as people sort of try to decide whether she should stay on as leader during this leadership review, one of the things to think about is how voters are viewing her particular skill set, like her attributes, and what they've sort of noticed so far, because that gap of like neutral about her is astounding to me, because, in your data you have, I think it was like 10% still don't know her, which is actually a pretty low number for a leader.
Never heard of her.
Yeah. Right? Like it's an incredibly low number. And I was very shocked by that versus the 33% who are still neutral about her. Like it's wild to know someone and still be very meh, to put it your way, about them. So I'm wondering, like, based on the attributes you saw, like I think there's some things that could be built on there. And I'm wondering if you can dig into that data of like what people really think about her as a person. Those who know her and aren't neutral about her, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you get a little bit more specific, people are kind of more generous in their evaluation of her. So when we ask overall favorability, you really only have kind of that 9% that have a very favorable view. And then once I tested, specific attributes like hardworking, good communicator, competent, the percentage of people that think that those apply, like we get to, about a half of voters that would say, yeah, I think she seems hardworking, a good communicator, she seems competent. There's a little bit more polarization around the idea of, which I think kind of is to a certain extent just like a reflection of partisanship. But the idea that she's qualified to be premier will bring positive change. That's kind of like an equally yes and no proposition. But you do have about 1 in 4 voters who do not know on any single one of the attributes if they apply or not. So again, going back to them not really knowing her, it really comes out in the data as well. But there is, I would say, of the attributes that I tested, her top 3 attributes are, again, hardworking, good communicator, competent.
I think that's really interesting because, like, if I was somebody really angling to keep Crombie, and again, I'm neutral and don't really, I'm not neutral. I don't have an opinion yet of which way I'm going. But I think if I was her supporters, I would glom onto the hardworking part, because to me, that makes the argument for keeping her on, because she can fill that gap over time. Your data also did look at, it's not looking at her in a vacuum. It's looking at her compared to Ford, compared to Martin Stiles, compared to both of the parties that they represent. What really struck me in the data was that, like, the accessible pool of voters, the people who were not like absolutely never voting for you, everyone else who was like, maybe we'll see, to varying strengths. It was pretty consistent across all the parties. But what really struck me was OLP had the highest number with a new leader out of all the options, including Ford. And I think, I don't know how much you can read into that, but what are your thoughts on, like, the fact that they all pretty much have a competing advantage, and it's really just about who can make the best pitch? Like, is that where we're at in Ontario politics?
I would say that the the NDP, the Ontario NDP, and the OLP voter under Stiles and under Crombie, their vote pools look fairly similar. And if anything, the Liberal pool is a little stronger because we have more people that say that they'd be certain to vote for the Liberals. So with Crombie at the helm, 59% of voters say that they would at least consider voting for the Liberal Party, which, to be fair, is not that bad. Like it could be worse. But and this is kind of typically the dynamic. Like the conservative, the PC voter pool is larger, so 65% of voters would consider voting for the Ford PCs, and more are strongly motivated. So 23% are certain to vote for the PCs. But we do tend to see that with the conservatives because a conservative voter has fewer places to go, really. So you do tend to have like a stronger core, whereas especially in Ontario, like OLP and NDP voters can kind of switch back and forth and they don't really necessarily know for sure. But I also test, and this is something that I did for the Trudeau study as well, is test the proposition. And it is, it's very much asterisk, like it is very much a hypothetical, but testing the voter pool if the party was led by someone other than Crombie. And what we see is the total accessible vote pool increases by 8 points, which is a pretty substantial gap, right? Like we're talking about a lot of new voters that would then consider voting for the party. Of course, it depends on who you fill in the blank with, like who is that someone else. But as a hypothetical, more people would be open to voting for the brand and voting for the party. As a point of comparison, when I asked this about Trudeau, I think that increase was 14 points, but we were like much deeper in the ditch. So it's kind of, it makes sense. You had more people to kind of like draw on that would be a more typical Liberal voter. But it's definitely, it's an increase.
I think that point is so important because I think a lot of people who are thinking about this leadership review are, for a long time, and I think your data might change some of this because it's putting some names in the window, but for a long time, it's very much just like comparing the current leader to the almighty, like that old thing of like, if I had the mythical perfect candidate, what would we be at? And I think that 8% might be a little bit of that thinking, because again, once you put a permanent leader in place, that number tends to go down. We have seen that in the past. I think over the last 7 years of Ford being in power, we've pulled the best under John Fraser as interim leader because it's not a permanent thing. So I do think that's interesting. I know this isn't really your wheelhouse necessarily, but do you think, you mentioned the 14% with Trudeau, and we know that obviously Carney as leader really brought up the party in a huge way comparatively. Do you think that Carney's influence sort of buoyed our numbers at all provincially? I know you were looking at the federal numbers, not the provincial numbers at the time, but that and, the Trump situation, I think we're going to be in that situation at least until Kuzma comes up for review next year. So that's not going away anytime soon, but that may go away after that period to, some degree. Do you think those two issues change anything in terms of the calculus here, or is that sort of where we're going to be until Trump's out of office? If he ever leaves office, that's an open question too.
Well, it's hard to say, right? Like, I don't know, but like, what is the news story of the day? Like, do we have a change focus, a reason for a change focus to healthcare, to the education system? Like, I don't know if there's anything that is going to be breaking. I feel like we had a very unexpected theme in our 2018 campaign where suddenly we were talking about like hallway medicine a lot, and we weren't necessarily anticipating that. And like, that has not been improved under Ford. So like, I don't know 100%, but right now in kind of the configuration that we have, like Ford is able, like he has the most bizarre favorability and approval trend line that I've ever seen in a politician, in that it can like revert course. Usually these are like, you start to see a slip and then she slips and then he seems to have the ability to like rebound and rebuild. And part of that is probably like, probably a lack of solid opposition, right? And so then when the narrative kind of changes and he's able to really, they do an excellent job of narratively meeting the moment like they did it for COVID, and you saw his approval improve, and they're doing it with Trump where they like are on the beat. And if you don't have the periods in between of like really strong opposition, then it is kind of what is allowing these rebounds in him to like really seize these moments, I think.
I think he really is a Teflon premier. Like I remember I was at the Raptors parade in 2019. I walked that route and he got booed on stage there because people really wanted to get rid. His party was thinking of dumping him at the time, and he's never been as low since, I don't think. But even COVID, you mentioned COVID, he was like doing really well then. But then there was the part where he was like going to criminalize kids using jungle gyms and parks, and that didn't go over well. And there was a little bit of a blip there. So he is good at rebounding. And the one thing I think about, like, if, for fellow liberals, the thing I think about is like, they constantly think, well, if world events sort of just get out of the way, people will see his terrible record on the economy and all these other issues. But like, we live in a fast paced time. Like, I don't know that there's ever going to be a time where we don't live in interesting times. And so I don't think we can count on like that going out of the way. And, if he's going to rise to the moment, one of the big frustrations I have, which I raised with Bonnie Crombie, is that we did not have an economic message in the campaign. And that was the ballot question. And we just decided, oh, we'll talk about healthcare. And maybe that, accounts for some of the bump up we had. But like, those people weren't voting for Ford anyway. Right. So I have a lot of feelings about that kind of stuff. But on Ford, like, this is purely speculative, and I haven't asked you about this, but there's a lot of people who think that he's not going to stick around and that maybe he wants to run federally and yada, yada, yada. Have you done any polling on like PC leadership options, like in the future?
Oh,
have you looked at that at all?
No, when he's still at like 45% in the polls, it's like makes it less, I don't know that. No, I haven't. But I did, in the midst of the campaign, write an article about like, is it time for him to think about resigning? Which is not to say like the numbers indicate that it's time to resign, but in the campaign, even still, I forget the exact figures, but like he does have kind of a complicated opinion environment, which is there are a lot of people that disapprove of him and don't necessarily think that he has been a great premier, even if they kind of like him, and also maybe feel like they don't have an alternative to a certain extent. Like there isn't, politics is contrast, and it's about alternatives and who you have available to you. And they clearly were feeling like the NDP, for PC voters, feeling like the NDP is weak and the OLP are weak. And I would consider that to be, then them feeling like they don't have serious alternatives to their vote. But with this serious candidate, someone like I think that scenario can change, because I do think that there are a couple of areas that I would, based on this research, that I would really want to dig into. Like, I don't know that I know definitively what, and having tried to work on anti-Ford branding in like 2018, he's really hard and the environment was different. It was actually probably easier in 2018 than it is now. In that, like, his performance at City Hall was more fresh and recent, and the chaos of the 4 years was more recent. His brand is completely different than it was then, and there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of like really positive things that they have to build off of. But I'm sure that there's a lot in terms of like specific policy files and different areas that like that I think that this data points to that I would be really interested in kind of exploring further.
I guess the big question that we've just been delaying is, in your research, we always have this question in politics of like time for change. And it's a measure that people use usually for incumbent governments between elections to see if people are starting to wane on a leader or their party. That's essentially what you've asked here about Bonnie Crombie is, do people think the Ontario Liberal Party needs a new leader, or should they stick with Bonnie Crombie? What did you find on that question?
Yeah, so I found that people are more likely than not to think that the OLP should have a different leader. So 48% of Ontarians think yes, the OLP should get a new leader. 27% say no. And again, a quarter of voters don't know either way. So don't, again, kind of blank slate. They don't really know. I think what there's a couple things that are, to me, this is probably the most important or most interesting data. So one is only 10% of voters strongly disagree that it's time for a new leader. So 10% that are kind of strong defenders of Bonnie Crombie. And if we look at the base, so people that even with Bonnie Crombie at the helm say that they would be certain to vote for the Ontario Liberal Party, they're actually very divided. 41% say yes, we need a new leader. And again, these are like the core, the base of our supporters. And 46% say no, we should stay where we are. And those two polls of people that strongly agree we need a new leader and strongly disagree that are depending, they are the same size. So about 25% of our core voters have a strong view one way or the other, which is kind of astounding, because when I had done this same research about Trudeau, the only people that were coming to Trudeau's defense were the core, were people that were partisan liberals that were going to vote for us no matter what. That at that point, I think had declined to like 6% of voters. Like, it was a small group of people, but he was still their guy. Like, they still would have preferred to vote for him out of anyone else. And they were loyal to him, where it was like every other voter that saw the writing on the wall and felt like it was a time for a change. So this is something that is really interesting. And maybe it's partially a product of, not winning, where you have base voters being more disgruntled, but there's definitely like discontent within the core.
So I think that's really interesting for party members, because they are two very different situations. So number one, the loyalty that Trudeau had was built over a decade in power, but also the rebuilding from third to first, right? Like, that was a big part of why people were ride or die with him. A lot of caucus, like, we know it took a very long time for caucus even to start to turn on him, because they owed their seats to him, and like, that's how they got into power in the first place. So there was a very different relationship between the leader and party members and, party faithful, because of that history. And I think, like, you can talk about policy lens and stuff like that too. Like, I, as a progressive person, like, I think, I have my issues with Justin Trudeau's leadership, but I still think he's the most progressive prime minister we've ever had in Canada. And I'm a lesser B. Pearson type person. So, like, I have a lot of time for the policies that he put in place, and, Carney is taking things in a different direction. There's all that conversation. With Bonnie Crombie, you don't have that same built-in loyalty, because one, she was a federal MP, she was a councillor, she was a mayor. Her time in the provincial politics, she's been there as a volunteer and as a, young liberal and things like that, but it's not what's top of mind for people. That loyalty to the party and that involvement in the party is not central to her story as a politician. So that, I think, is a little different. She hasn't had the time as leader. She hasn't had the victories as leader to sort of really build up those ties to the people in the party. So I think that division in the party is really, really interesting. Some of that's a hangover from the previous race, and there are people who say she didn't do enough to reach out to the people who didn't support her last time. All of that is part of the conversation. But I think one of the things you brought up that's really important is when Trudeau was having, people having doubts about his leadership, he hadn't yet gone into the next election. And a lot of people were saying, well, Trudeau's a great campaigner, so like, maybe he can pull it out. I don't think anybody, actually, a lot of people made the argument about Bonnie Crombie that she would be great on the campaign trail and would easily win. And, I think that was wishful thinking of any politician, that they would do the same that they do at the municipal level, at the provincial level. But a big part of the campaign for her was like, she can campaign, she can win. Having lost the election and having not had the big wins that, they had predicted, that's a very different scenario than Trudeau staring down an election. What do you think? Like, was there any feedback on those kinds of things in your conversations with people?
To a certain extent, like, the Trudeau comparison is probably like, it's relevant, but it's not. Like, it is so different. And the provincial to federal dynamic, like, is so different. Like, in some ways it's kind of not that relevant. I don't really have it for sure in the data. I don't know that in terms of who the alternative candidates that they're kind of excited by. I sort of assume that there's maybe one or two things, but this is a theory. Like, I don't know for certain. It's probably a feeling like we didn't win. And I don't know that they're assuming that we will win the next election. So kind of feeling like we're still like stuck in the ditch. And potentially some policy differences as well, which I think comes out a little bit in terms of the candidates that they would be interested in.
So let's talk about those candidates, because I think that's why a lot of people are here, and we've, really held out on them until this long. So you did, having answered that question of whether people want to race or not, we'll see what happens on the floor, because to me, that comes down to a turnout question at that point. Because of course, the ballot question is not going to be, do you want to keep Bonnie Crombie? It's going to be, do you want a new leadership election? If enough people say no, she'll stay on as leader. And again, that's, 50% plus one. But regardless of what happens there, people are starting to think about alternatives, and you've done some polling on that. And I think these are some really, really interesting results. I think there's some names there that people might not have immediately thought of that are really, really interesting. Can you talk about the candidates you polled about, what you found in terms of people's responses to that?
Yeah. So the challenge with an exercise like this is that people don't usually know who our politicians are other than the leaders. And that's the same situation here. So I test favorability of the candidates. So understanding, unprompted, where these people are sitting reputationally. And then I also provided bios and a photo of 7 different candidates that I thought and I will also say, I don't actually know if any of these people are interested in the job. They're kind of a combination of people that are rumored, and then people that I think are kind of good symbols of the type of candidate that could be interesting or that I wanted to kind of see stacked up against Crombie. So I focused on 7 candidates. So Nader Skyn-Smith, naturally, Karina Gold, Navdeep Bains, Marco Mendicino, John Fraser, and then I have 2 that I consider to be kind of my wild card picks. Mohammed Faki, if people aren't familiar, he's the CEO of Paramount Fine Foods, and he's also been a very significant advocate for on Gaza. So in talking about the humanitarian crisis there. So for him, his inclusion, I have no idea if he has an interest in entering politics, but I kind of used him as my symbol of potential enthusiasm there, right? Like I think people often think of leadership races as having the potential for, I don't want to call it special interest. I think that's like disparaging, but for people that are really motivated by an issue, to really organize and put forth a candidate. So he's sort of my poster child for where I think there is a lot of enthusiasm there.
He was actually in the last leadership race. He was very much courted, mentioned as a candidate, all that kind of stuff. So this is not out of the blue at all.
Compelling communicator with a very significant online following. Like I think when I looked, he has, I don't even know, I think it was like 44,000 or something like that Instagram followers. Like he has a profile. Don't quote me on that number. And then the last person that I tested was Dr. Andrew Buzari, who is a physician in Toronto and has a very active online presence where he talks a lot. He was also on the Hurley Burley. Shout out. That was like a really great interview. That's where I discovered him.
Senator Bernie Sanders recently had him in some of his content as well. So he's got him pretty high profile.
He has a huge following on Twitter. I see a lot of his stuff on like my LinkedIn, but he talks a lot about like the social determinants of health. So with our heat wave, I've seen a lot of content from him of like talking about how we should be prescribing air conditioners instead of people having heart failure and coming to the hospital for like a $15,000.
I definitely retweeted that yesterday because it's one of my favorite points. The other thing he also brings up all the time, which I'm obsessed with because I used to have it on a Post-it note in my office at Ministry of Housing, was the difference in cost between hospitalization, prison, and just like affordable housing and shelters and stuff. And he brings that up all the time. I'm a big fan. He's also really young. I don't know if he's young. He looks young. He's, like a handsome young guy. Like I can see the appeal here.
Yeah. So I felt like very good and excited about this kind of list of candidates. I think that it's very interesting of the moment that we're in. I made this point already, but it is important to know that, when I test their favorability, these people are not known. Like people either say, I've never heard of this person for the most part, or I have a neutral impression, which is usually like a smart person's dodge of like, I don't actually know, but they're like, I want to not say that I haven't heard of them. Sometimes, even for like a Karina Gold who had a more high profile role, or even Nate Smith, who's like we would think of as like political junkies as being like relatively high profile, aren't generally well known by the public. So in that way, it's sort of a similar dynamic to what we are seeing with Bonnie Crombie, which is like she still has a tremendous amount of brand building to do. And any of the new candidates that I tested would also have significant brand building to do. So I don't want to overlook that once we get into some of the like stack up of how they do well or how their bios perform relative to Crombie.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that because you have sort of the awareness level in your data here, but you also have a second component, which is the excitement people feel for these alternatives. So regardless of whether they know them or not, they've seen the bio, they have a sense of who they are. Can you talk about who sort of polled well on that front? Because I think first impressions are really important, and you'd have a similar first impression come out to people if one of these people were to become leader or a candidate for leader.
Yeah, so in giving the bio for each candidate, I purposely made them very positive. So I wanted them all to put their best foot forward. I also, I don't expect people to read that much about them. So like a comprehensive, like pro and con, like that's not really like a fair thing to ask of a participant. And also just kind of wanted to understand like almost like the personas, because again, they don't know who these people are. So a little bit is like they're responding to the bio and the idea of the person. And then there's different questions of like their performance as a campaigner, their communication style, all of these other kinds of different types of things, their political acumen, their issue set, all of that. But of the candidates, so the person that I would consider to be the front runner of this slate is Karina Gold. And in her bio, I specifically talked about her role in implementing the $10 a day childcare, and that she ran in the federal leadership race representing the more progressive kind of wing of the party. And from that, we have a little over half of voters saying that sounded like an exciting candidate, more liberal voters being excited by the prospect of her candidacy. And then I also, for all of the candidates, tested a forced choice matchup. So who would you rather vote for if you had to choose, which of course our elections don't work like this, but if you had to choose between Karina Gold and choose between Bonnie Crombie, who would you vote for? And among the general population, Karina Gold wins out 54-46. And that is the only candidate that is straight up has an advantage among the general population. And that's sort of throughout the voters that would consider for her, where she performs well, but not necessarily, among our most core liberal voters. I think they would still tend to choose Crombie as their preferred candidate. She's probably more familiar, but as like an overall proposition among the general population, she performs very well.
So what I found really interesting about that, and not to put you on the spot at all, but what I found really interesting about that was it's actually basically the reverse numbers of the matchup between Nate and Bonnie Crombie in your polling data. It's also basically the reverse of what happened on the final ballot, more or less, in the last leadership race between Bonnie and Nate. Do you have any thoughts about that, of why like Karina is somewhat different? Is there something about her that seems slightly more palatable to those who are looking for sort of a progressive alternative? Because I do, in looking at this data, and of course I'm not looking at the crosstabs, but in looking at this data, it seems to me that people are looking for a progressive alternative to both perhaps Bonnie, who maybe has not been as progressive as they want, or, especially Doug Ford. They want like a really clear progressive alternative.
That's kind of what I inferred from the data. Like, I don't know 100%, but given that her bio was basically like, this is a progressive one. And then maybe the combination of like, once they saw her photo, maybe they recognized her. Yeah, so it's possible that's kind of what I assume. And it could also be like, this is a young woman, and maybe that is a point of contrast to a Doug Ford. Like, I don't really know. You would need to do more research and really understand like what is the motivating factor. But given the information that they were provided, that's kind of what I assume they're responding to.
Something that also intrigues me as somebody who, you know, worked in the win years and saw the misogyny of that time, and I think a lot of I have this a similar feeling about Obama, that a lot of people who maybe do have hints of like racism or misogyny are willing to vote for a candidate that kind of goes against that once, so they can show like, oh no, see, it's not about that for me, and then they sort of get rid of that thinking. And what's interesting to me here is that like the top performing person is another woman, because I would have assumed, just based on my political experience, that, you know, people would want to throw up a man against the woman. But here it's two women at the top, which I find kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know 100%. Like I think it's a lot to kind of presume. The one thing that I will say on that is I think sometimes we like, I don't know, like I worked on, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the Win brand. How can it, how could we improve it? What is actually driving it? And people aren't going to come out and say like, I'm sexist, like you, or that it's because of a woman. But then you start getting factors like that are popping up around like, oh, you know, this candidate is weak, or, you know, more stuff like that, that are like coded terms. But being different can also be a strength. And I do think one of the lessons that I've learned, I think especially from the American context with Hillary Clinton and with Kamala Harris, is like, if you want the benefits of a candidate being different, you have to let them act differently. And I think Kamala was the most exciting when she was the most different, and she was loose, and her social media was loose. And then as she was more, let's say, conservative in her rhetoric in, say, interviews, like more of the like good candidate, the like capital P politician, looked appealing. And like, spoiler, people don't really like politicians that much. So like, to the extent that you can maybe not look and feel and sound like a typical politician, maybe Karina's kind of scratching that issue a little bit. I don't know. But that would be something that you have to explore a lot more.
I do think the Harris part is interesting because, you know, my sense of it was her and her VP nom, like they were soaring when they were just doing politics really differently and really freshly. And as soon as you got to the convention and the consultants from the DNC came in, it started to feel more like every other campaign. And that's when they started to take a dive. So I think you're right that having, and I think that maybe is part of why like none of the people who were the also rans last time are really tracking in these numbers, because, you know, like people have seen that before. They're looking for something different. That's probably one of Ford's strengths, is that he doesn't feel like a lot of other politicians, you know, with his folksy charm and all those other things. I bring up
it's also strategically cultivated, which is why he will talk about his sleepover with Mark Carney and and all of that kind of stuff. That is like truly endearing, right? Like that is, people are like, the partisanship, like it is exhausting, right? Like it is. So his ability to kind of, you know, play nice, even as like his team is knifing Pierre Poilievre, has mass appeal, right? Like it just feels like that someone has the province's best interest at heart. And sometimes I felt like that for the campaign sort of missed that understanding. Like sometimes you can almost like over villainize, and it feels not correct. Like then that makes you kind of the typical politician, is like, yeah, like, I don't know. Sometimes I just think of like, what if we had just said like, yeah, he's a nice guy, but like, he doesn't know how to manage healthcare or like, you know, like that kind of
exactly.
of like, I don't think people think of him. And this is sort of one of my points for one of the other candidates. I don't think they think of him as like a details guy. Like he's not a manager. And sometimes that's the correction that you're looking for in the system, is like moving to like Carney is like a technocrat. And that's appealing.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because this was always my thing about Doug Ford. One, I don't think we've ever actually, now that he has a record, like ever since he's been put in office, we haven't really gone after him as, you know, like a manager of government. We've always gone after him as like, you know, let's scare people about his personality. Well, people like his personality. So like, you're not going to win on that front, but he is doing terrible things to the province. So talk about that. And I have long said to other liberals, like voters do not hate Doug Ford the way you do. So you can't campaign on that. And I think one of the biggest problems we've had is that we have run every campaign without having putting anything else in the window of like the alternative vision of Ontario. We did not do that in the last campaign, really. We're just like, well, he's bad. And so, I think that's a big part of it. You did just mention the details piece, and I want to talk about that because I think that was a big part of Carney becoming leader and winning the election. I think is that people really saw him as somebody who understood what needed to be done. You just mentioned there's another candidate that you polled who you think has a similar vibe.
Yeah. So the person that I would kind of consider to be, I would say like the second place finisher, maybe tied in second, would be Andrew Buzari. And so what I told voters about him is basically he's a doctor. He talks a lot about kind of like the social factors that lead to, I use normal person speak, but the social factors that lead to poor health outcomes. So talking about things like poverty and homelessness, and he was tied with Karina as the most exciting candidate overall, and interestingly stands out as appealing to people that would say that they would never vote for our party. So I assume because of like the issue set that it is healthcare related, pulling some from both parties, and that, healthcare is very fundamental regardless of partisanship. And then also in that kind of two-way matchup between him and Bonnie Crombie, it's a tie overall. So this is someone no one knows, but that idea of a healthcare, to me, what I infer from that is like a healthcare expert is very compelling, or someone that is, to me, almost a different version of potentially a different version of like a Carney kind of appeal, where you have like the most expert on the economy to like the most expert, like a very different kind of person related to healthcare, which I think there was a reason why the OLP focused so heavily on healthcare. Like there is a lot of discontent there, whether or not that was like we were participating in the actual conversation that voters were having. Like clearly that wasn't the case, but there's definitely discontent there, and I find that to be a very interesting alternative. Like when I think of the person who is potentially the most different from Doug Ford, that might be it for me of the list of candidates. Like Doug Ford, populist; Andrew Buzari, expert, and that is interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think just having followed him online, like he's an excellent messenger too. Like the way he, like the air conditioner thing, like to me was like, I did tweet, this is how politicians should talk. Like it was very clear. It was really like in terms normal people can understand. And that is sometimes the gap you have with people who have a lot of expertise, is they're not able to bring it down to that level. I think maybe the nature of his work, he has to speak that way more regularly, so that helps. But I do think that is a really interesting piece, because I think one of the questions I've heard in the past is like, people don't like when liberals are just like talking really high level and all that stuff. And I fully agree, we need to be more accessible, but it doesn't mean we need to abandon the way we think about issues and actually wanting to solve problems properly, and actually looking at the causes of these problems. And then on the flip side for Karina, the argument I heard after Wynne lost was that we could never elect another woman as leader because we would never win an election. And I worry that people see Bonnie's loss as like a continuation of that narrative, and therefore we would have to go select a man. And I don't know that is true. I think there's a lot of misogyny out there. I know it's rising. I know, York University just put out a paper about how it's being weaponized as like a political strategy now. So all of those things are true. But having said that, like I think Karina's numbers here sort of debunk that a bit. And I think Andrew's numbers here sort of debunk the expertise piece as well. And it all suggests that were we to have a race, there could be some really interesting things that come out of it. But of course, we don't know if we're going to do that until the review in September. Before we go, do you have any like sort of closing thoughts you want to talk about in terms of the data that you've uncovered here?
I think I will just reiterate how much, one, this exercise is kind of hypothetical. Like I think there's a lot that is here to chew on. To me, what I think the data points to is the validity of having this conversation and this discussion and assessment of like a conversation about the leadership. Like, I don't think that it definitively came out that like it's time to move away from Bonnie Crombie. I don't think that the data is like really crystal clear on that. I also don't think it's really crystal clear on any of the other candidates. I do think that there's a lot to chew on. And that's kind of the task ahead of the membership, is to look at this, look at the one. Also, does anyone step forward? Does anyone want to compete? That's a huge question. I don't know. But I think regardless of who the candidate is, the task is finding a way to break through, like someone who can get attention. And I think that's part of the question of like, has Crombie learned the lessons of the campaign? Is she putting the processes, the team in place to be someone that can break through and build that brand? And is there anyone else that also can do that? And to me, that's, obviously the policy lens, all of that matters too. But if like, it's the tree in the forest or whatever, like if no one hears it, like we really need to start to figure this out. And I would say that this is the case on the, Carney captures a lot of attention, but I had written a piece about how much of at a deficit we are in terms of like content creation, and like the Conservatives are absolutely killing us in terms of online content, specifically on YouTube. Like we basically don't exist as a party on that platform. And so I think, which is the number one information source of Canadians. So like, I think I would be really focused on or really wanting to understand like who has a plan around that, who has an issue set that is resonant and who really kind of gets it. And yeah, that is what I'd be chewing on. I wouldn't say that I'm a declarative, like I would be similar to you. I have opinions, but I don't have like an answer, I guess, at this point in time. But I think that this is a lot to kind of chew on.
Totally agree. And I want to thank you for coming on here, because I think a lot of members feel the same way. They really just want to get into all of these issues without the weight of it being like, oh, you're loyal or disloyal. It's these are important conversations to have, and everyone's going to come to their own decision when they, go into the voter's booth at the AGM. But I think it's, really, really important to actually have this information and mull these issues as we go to there. So thanks for joining me today.
No, it was so great.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.